much. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Zoom News Conference. I am Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor of Ethnic Media Services. Our briefing today focuses on how climate change is changing our lives. Extreme weather events have marked this year in the US and the world. We know that climate change is bringing more than higher temperatures and modified weather patterns. It has the potential to change how we lead our lives, how we work, and even what we believe. During a briefing with Ethnic Media, organized by Ethnic Media Services, today, we will explore the deeper and more lasting potential effects of climate change, the societal impacts or costs, the public's reactions, as our deeply polarized politics get more and more affected by climate impacts, and even our spiritual lives as we grapple with our roles in the debacle. Our panel includes Hannah Hess, Associate Director of the Climate Impact Lab, Megan Mullin, Faculty Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, John Christensen, Adjunct Assistant Professor of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies at UCLA, and Anaís Reyes, Senior Exhibitions Associate at the Climate Museum. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, which we will address following each speaker as time allows. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions throughout the conference in the chat. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. And so now I am very pleased to welcome an incredible panel to deal with an essential issue for our times and our world. Each one of our panelists brings an important contribution to this conversation. And we're going to begin straight away with our first panelist, Hannah Hess, Associate Director of the Climate Impact Lab. Welcome to the briefing, Hannah.
Hello, thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. Are you seeing my PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So hello from Denver, Colorado. Today I'm representing the Climate Impact Lab, which is a nonprofit research collaboration that formed in 2016. For those not familiar with the Climate Impact Lab, which I think is true for most of this audience, we focus on raising awareness of how climate change is impacting people, turning our research into tools that can help design policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improving resilience to the climate impacts that we can't avoid by giving detailed information to decision makers. The overall problem that motivates our work in this area is the simple fact that lowering emissions is expensive. So on this chart in the lower left corner, we're looking at different possible climate futures that we might face depending on the emissions pathway that we choose. We tend to sort of look longingly at that green line as a low climate risk future, consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But it's really important to acknowledge that pulling society from that red line of unmitigated emissions down to that green line or even the yellow line, which is consistent with current policies in place today, is expensive. And importantly, it requires policymakers to divert resources from other goals that we care a lot about, like expanding affordable housing or investing in our education systems, for example. So the social cost of carbon, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is one approach to tackling this challenge by bringing in estimates of the costs of future climate change to weigh against the cost of new policies in a dollar-to-dollar comparison. Our team at the lab looks like that funnel on the right. We're a mix of economists, climate scientists, and data engineers who combine large climate data sets of temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise with computing power and tools from econometrics to carefully quantify what the impacts of climate change will be. So how does the social cost of carbon help tackle the challenge of figuring out the right policies to address this issue? The social cost of carbon, or SCC, is defined as the total damages caused to society from 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide. Oops, sorry. So a simple example is the tailpipe of your gas-powered car spewing carbon emissions. Those emissions stay in the atmosphere, raise carbon dioxide concentrations, and result in higher global average temperatures. That warming carries different consequences for each location around the globe, which the Climate Impact Lab measures through its research. Heat-related deaths and changes in the amount of food that farmers can produce are 2 examples. The SCC tells you the total monetary value of those changes. And to continue the car example, it could be used to estimate the benefit to society of new limits on vehicle tailpipe emissions and weigh those against the costs to the auto industry and the costs of enforcing that new rule. A lot on this slide. The Climate Impact Lab is currently estimating the costs to society in each one of these 15 subcategories that you see in the orange bubbles. The model that integrates all of this research to produce that dollar value estimate is the Data-Driven Spatial Climate Impact Model, or DSIM. And one of the empirical insights that comes out of DSIM is that the harms of global climate change will be unevenly distributed, with the potential to exacerbate existing inequalities. So how we know that is by studying the impacts at a very local level. The Climate Impact Lab divides the world into roughly 24,000 regions, collecting as much historical data as possible on the outcomes that we care about, like electricity use, and the weather that influences those outcomes. Then using future projections of how weather, population, and income will evolve to estimate the effects of climate change on humans. So last fall, ahead of COP27, we launched a new platform to make the information coming out of our research more accessible. It's called Human Climate Horizons, and it's a joint project with the UN Development Program. Especially in parts of the world where this sort of climate data is hard to come by, Human Climate Horizons is a valuable resource for understanding the physical effects of climate change, how those differ depending on the emissions outcomes that we achieve, and how impacts may evolve over generations. I've given on this slide an overview of the data that's currently available, and this fall we do plan to launch some new layers. Let's go to the platform so I can show you how it might be useful. So I'm going to select the US from this menu. I have selected the US since this is a US-based group. But if you're writing, say, for a specific diaspora community and wanted to include information on the impacts of climate change to that geography, you should be able to find it in this list. Right now, we're looking at mid-century, the annual impacts of climate change, roughly 30 years from now, under a moderate emissions scenario, which is consistent with current policies. And that's about 2.5 degrees Celsius of global average warming at the end of the century. So we can look at average annual temperature, the number of hot days occurring each year, the number of days below freezing, and you can use your cursor to explore the effects in individual counties going a level deeper. These push pins are for major cities. I'm going to just give an example of Orlando here. Historically, that 1986 to 2005 dot shows that the city experienced roughly 3 weeks of days with temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 C. By mid-century, that looks like 55 days, so nearly 2 months of that extreme heat. And then we can look at the impacts on humans. I'll just give one example here. heat, the most consequential effect of heat is on our health. So both hot and cold temperatures exacerbate respiratory conditions, cardiovascular conditions, and they can interact with medications and cause really dire consequences. So more hot temperatures throughout the year are leading in the city of Orlando to an increase in the death rate of 19 per 100,000 population compared to a future world with no climate change. For some context, that is more lethal than car crashes, which today have a mortality rate of 14 per 100,000 in the United States. I'm going to stop there. I'm at time, but I am happy to talk more about this platform and how it can be useful in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time and your attention to this important topic.
Thank you, Hannah. I think this is extremely helpful to reporters who want to report about diaspora communities and what's going on in their countries of origin. So if you can put that link in the chat, that would be great, so they can have the platform. I think Mark had a question. I don't know if you can answer that, but you probably can. Mark?
Hi. I've long tried to determine data in making personal choices. If I take the time to take public transit and then don't burn 2 gallons of gas, can we quantify how much those emissions are not, because a lot of this is about changing our behaviors in terms of, reducing emissions. But I've never been able to find that information. Any leads on that for me, please?
I know that the EPA has a website where you can sort of get an average of, I'm traveling, they use the car example too. I'm traveling this far in a gas-powered car. Here's the tons of CO2. And it's true that I will dig around for that link, and if I can find it, drop it into the chat. Right. And it's true that this social cost of carbon, this dollar figure that's incorporating a full range of different impacts through the year, goes very far out through 2300, but it can be used to give to essentially give a price tag of how much damage is being caused out into the future by those by the marginal effect of those tons of carbon dioxide.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you have an opinion as to what is the most serious social cost of climate change?
I would say this is not just an opinion, but actually when we do the quantification, it is this health impact, the mortality impact, specifically how temperatures are impacting all cause death rates. So we can't draw out an individual. It's not drawing out an individual cause. It's looking at what is the existing all-cause mortality rate and how that would change into the future in a world where there are fewer extremely cold temperatures and more extremely hot temperatures, both of which have an effect on health. So the empirical data-driven answer is it's the mortality effect that is the greatest on society.
And that goes to the question that Henrietta Burrows wants to ask. Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Pilar. So what would be the cause of those increasing deaths due to heat? For example, you could say heart attacks, you could say strokes, but those might happen anyway, even in colder weather. So how could one specifically say there is a specific amount of deaths that are related and caused by the increasing heat?
That's a great question. It involves all of the historical records that the economists that I work with are looking at, where they're isolating just for these 2 factors of what was the daily temperature and what was the death rate that occurred in a given place over a very long period of time and at a very granular scale on the globe. And it's just observing the changes that happen in the death rate. So you can't tease out what the individual costs are, but you can say on a hotter day, here's how many more people are coming into the hospital. One thing that makes this research difficult is that on a death certificate, you aren't going to write there was a heat wave on this day. It was the two examples that you mentioned are very accurate, a heart attack or a stroke. But by looking at the data this way, you can tease out the effect of temperature and how it has this quantifiable impact on mortality rates in a given location. And the same thing is true for extreme cold temperatures as well. Sorry, I can't give a more relatable answer there.
Pretty sure there's research out there on this question. Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to move on to the next speaker, but please stay on because we'll have an opportunity to for more comments. I now have the pleasure to welcome John Christensen. John?
Thank you, Pilar. I'm John Christensen. I teach and do research at UCLA in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the Luskin Center for Innovation. And I'm a founder of our Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies. And we created the laboratory, or LENS, to study the diverse stories that people tell about the environment and to work with storytellers, journalists, writers, artists, filmmakers, and others to tell new stories about people in the environment. So thank you for this invitation to talk with you all today. I know you all play such important roles in your communities in telling stories in the context of your cultures and histories and languages. And I know how important that is. That's why we founded LENS. I'd like to share with you some perspective, not on the phenomena of climate change and extreme weather, wildfires and floods and other disasters, but on what climate change means to people. That is to say, the meanings we attach to climate change, the stories or narratives we tell about climate change, how we frame climate change, and the recurring debates about the meaning of climate change. I want to say that none of what I'm going to say should take anything away from interest in the phenomena of climate change, extreme weather, wildfires, floods, and the like. I trust you will cover those events, but I hope it might also be interesting for you to explore the meaning of climate change for your communities and the different stories they tell, because that could be interesting and useful for all of us. First, I want to start with a quick and vast historical overview of the stories that people tell about natural disasters. As Kate Rigby shows in her magisterial book, Dancing with Disaster: Environmental Histories, Narratives, and Ethics for Perilous Times, the way that people think about so-called natural disasters can change over time. When the Black Death or bubonic plague killed 25 million people in Europe in the 14th century, it was seen by many as a righteous punishment from an angry God, as other disasters often were too. When the Great Lisbon earthquake killed 70,000 people in 1755 on All Saints' Day, when many were in church, that began to change. The disaster began to be seen as a natural disaster, and the victims were seen not as sinners deserving punishment, but as innocent victims deserving help. That view persists and is prevalent to this day, although climate change and its effects are also increasingly seen not as natural disasters, but as righteous punishment for our sins by an angry nature. Second, I want to fast forward to the question of doubt. While most people believe that climate change is real and that it is caused by the activities of human beings and their emissions of greenhouse gases, there are some who doubt and some who deny either or both of those propositions. We know that doubt has been purposefully created and aided and abetted by public relations campaigns, by fossil fuel companies that derived their methods from the tobacco industry, which once declared in documents discovered during the tobacco trials, doubt is our product. We call this agnogenesis, or the cultural creation of ignorance. The study of this phenomena is called agnotology. Just like the creation of knowledge, the creation of ignorance and doubt will always be with us and worthy of understanding. Third, I want to turn now to the identities that we construct for ourselves and our communities. The phrase climate change, like the word environment, is one of the most polarizing words in the American political lexicon. This is not true in many other parts of the world, but it is a significant factor in our country. If you tell me what you think about climate change, I can predict with a fairly high degree of probability which party you identify with in elections. This is because how we interpret the phrase climate change is not just about the physical processes that the phrase labels, but is also determined, like other concepts, by our own frames, narratives, and values, the way we see the world, the stories we tell about the world and ourselves, and what we care about. And all of those things constitute our identities, who we are. A few years ago, the Associated Press interviewed me because the Nebraska legislature was reluctant to fund a study of climate adaptation by the University of Nebraska. I told the reporter, if the conversation were about crop yields, drought, rainfall, and growing seasons, instead of climate change, it might be a different story. You'll hear another example of this today regarding renewable energy. Fourth, and finally, I want to suggest that we can think about climate change not just as a problem to be solved, but also as a resource for thinking, telling stories, and understanding ourselves and the world. As a human geographer, Mike Hume argues in his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, Understanding Controversy, Inaction, and Opportunity. The problem of climate change has increasingly subsumed vast fields of human inquiry, from the physical sciences to the biological and ecological sciences to economics, politics, sociology, history, art, literature. The list could go on and on. Nearly everything can and sometimes is subordinated to climate change: health, economic well-being, justice, and more. When the problem becomes so big and wicked that we think it has to be solved to solve everything else, its power as a resource for thinking critically diminishes. If we think of climate change instead as a resource for understanding ourselves and our world, we can use it as a thread to tell all kinds of stories that help us understand our many different problems and opportunities. In this light, I think our former governor here in California, Jerry Brown, was a genius at using climate change and the extreme weather and wildfires to which global warming contributes as a resource. Jerry Brown used the pulpit of the governor's office to warn loudly and constantly about the existential threat that climate change poses to our civilization. He pointed to raging wildfires and a persistent drought, things that people could see and feel in their communities and lives. And he asked people to do something, to take action, to have agency. That too is a key to storytelling, the agency of characters. Jerry Brown asked Californians to conserve water, and they did. Urban water use in California dropped by 20%. I like to call this the California way: sunny, with a chance of apocalypse. We can make a difference with the stories that we tell about climate change if we use this as an opportunity to also understand these stories in the richly diverse cultures, histories, and languages that you all represent. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was incredible. It just came to mind that when we journalists are out there covering stories, we tend to cover the immediate, what's happening now. We don't really, rarely we think about the long term. What would you recommend to ethnic media when they look at issues such as, immigration, economics, et cetera, so many issues that we cover from our diaspora communities, that we represent here in Ethnic Media Services. What would you recommend? What kinds of stories do you think we should be telling? Or maybe we are already, but maybe we should cover more.
Well, I think in this way that I mentioned, you could think of climate change as a thread that you could follow and explore in stories about immigration, about health, about the resilience of your communities, about the factors that can increase resilience and decrease those extreme heat days, like parks and urban greening and trees. Colleagues of ours at UCLA in the public health department did a study that was published recently that showed in Los Angeles County, a county of 10 million people, if you just brought up if you looked at all of the communities in Los Angeles County that have below average tree canopy and below average park space, and if you just brought those communities up to the average, not exceeding the average, but just up to the average in park space and tree canopy, you would add nearly 1 million years of life expectancy to the current residents of Los Angeles County. And we know where those 1 million years would be added. They would be added in places like Southeast LA, where a child born today has a life expectancy of roughly 10 years less than a child born on the west side of Los Angeles. So this is really a matter of life and death. And I think that covering climate change, not just as the physical phenomena and the science, but really looking at the meaning of it for people and following it through these different stories and threads could be, a really productive resource for storytelling for your communities.
I'm muted. Absolutely. Wow. Thank you, John. I'm going to move on, but please stay with us. And I'm going to invite Megan Mullin. She's the faculty director of the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA. Megan, welcome.
Hello, good morning, and hello, and good afternoon to some of you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to learn from the other wonderful speakers on this panel. I am, as I said, a professor of public policy at UCLA. I am the faculty director of the Luskin Center for Innovation, which does actionable research on environmental policy, including equitable policies that can help communities grapple with the effects of climate change. And our previous speakers have really outlined many of those effects and strategies we could take to help reduce those harms. I'm also a political scientist by training, and I've spent
over a decade studying climate change politics in the United States. And that's what I'm going to focus on in my comments today. And the most important characteristic of climate change politics in the United States and increasingly globally, the most important characteristic is division. In a nation that is deeply polarized across partisan lines, there is no other issue that divides Democrats from Republicans more than climate change. And even as the effects of climate change are becoming more visible and becoming more widely recognized, that gap is wider now than ever before. Democrats are now nearly universal in their belief that human-caused climate change is real, and Democrats are growing ever more concerned. While concern among Republicans in the United States, in the mass public, and among elected leaders, that concern remains minimal. When Pew Research, one of our leading national survey organizations, asks annually wide representative samples of the American public about their priorities for government action in the coming year after year, among Republicans, climate change ranks at the bottom of their priorities. And the gap between climate change and any other issue, be it poverty or social security or defense or crime, that gap is wide. So this is a long-running condition in American politics, but the implications of that partisan gap are starting to change. For decades, partisan division on climate change has translated into gridlock. The division has meant inaction. Because control of the federal government is closely divided on partisan lines, there hasn't been the possibility of building a majority coalition to implement climate action, to enact legislation to tackle this problem. And actions by Democratic presidents when they were in office would then be reversed by their Republican successors. But conditions are starting to change. And I want to talk about 3 opportunities for some climate action, even while this partisan divide persists. The first opportunity is that Democrats in government and in the mass public have become more cohesive in their concern about climate and in their treatment of climate change as a party priority. And because of this growing cohesiveness among Democrats, that has expanded the scope of climate action when Democrats are in power. And so we see Democratic-led states taking on increasingly bold actions. And at the federal level, we've now seen the enactment of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, historic levels of investment in climate mitigation, and sort of movement of the whole of federal government to tackle some of the implications of climate change, the effects in terms of heat and sea level rise and drought and floods. So that's the first sort of changing tide on climate change. The second is that while Republican leaders and Republican political officials are continuing to deny the severity of climate change, to stand in the way of government action. At the same time, clean energy expansion is concentrated in Republican-led states. 38% of the nation's operational clean power capacity is situated in just 4 states that are traditionally Republican states: Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. And, by and large, the reason is because these states have geographies that are conducive to wind and solar energy production. The leadership of those states have cast their lots with fossil fuels, right? They've used renewable energy as a scapegoat for energy grid vulnerabilities, for example, and continue to sort of resist the transition. But the transition is underway regardless. And so it suggests that markets, right, and federal action when it occurs can start to overcome politics in this transition to a clean energy economy. The third sort of shift is, as we're seeing more visibly these climate impacts, my collaborator, Pat Egan at NYU, and I do a lot of work on sort of how climate is affecting the population of the United States. And we've found that Republicans are in fact more at risk from flood and fire projected impacts from climate change than are Democrats. And so as we're looking at the investments that we'll need to help protect populations from some of these climate impacts, we may start to see less resistance from Republicans for those investments than we've seen for investments in mitigation to control climate change as a whole. So there's good news here, right? The partisan division has long translated into gridlock on climate action. That partisan division hasn't changed. That's not the good news. It persists. It's wider than ever. But I'm seeing glimmers of possibility that climate action may yet be underway, even as American climate politics remains firmly in the grip of polarization.
Okay. Thank you, Megan, so much for that presentation. When you were speaking, I was just thinking, so has climate change itself changed our politics or helped change our politics? What do you think about that thought?
It has. Climate change has helped change our politics. It has helped, polarization, party polarization is this behemoth of a force, right? That has many, many feedbacks, right? So as the parties started to divide, political and media institutions changed in ways that then reinforced and fed that polarization and sort of accelerated the divide that was underway. And the emergence of climate change as an issue, right? This is an issue that in the 20th century wasn't on the political agenda, right? It came onto the political agenda right at that turn of the century. And that's one of the many forces that helped accelerate a polarization that was already underway, because it fed some of the sort of identity frameworks that John had talked about, because it has real implications for short-term out-of-pocket expenses for an energy transition. it helped sort of accelerate that divide. And one thing we've found is that the emergence of climate change onto the agenda also reinforced a divide in opinion about environment writ large, which historically had been an area of real bipartisan concern. Democrats and Republicans both cared about the quality of drinking water. And because climate change became sort of the identifiable issue for the environment, and a divide was growing there, it meant that we now see divides on wildlife conservation and drinking water quality and air quality in ways that we didn't see before.
Wow, that's so interesting. Henrietta has a question.
Yes, thanks so much. Is there a middle ground in the polarization that both sides share that we could reach? For example, if you were to say to people, dealing with climate change is economically profitable, how can we show this to happen and to have it shared by both parties?
There are many people who have worked on this for a long time, and I have to sadly report that so far the answer is no. We have not seen any successful effort to attach a frame to climate change or a language or a rationale about climate change that brings people together and overcomes this divide. We've seen business leaders try to do a lot in this space of bringing people together and proposing sort of a Republican way of tackling this problem. And it just hasn't had any legs. That division has only grown wider, and we haven't seen serious policy alternatives from the Republican Party. I think, right, the middle ground is existing in the market, right? The middle ground is existing in the fact that there is a clean energy expansion underway. There are plenty of Republicans who are working in that sector. And so while they may support politicians who are blocking government action, nonetheless, their day-to-day activities are supporting that transition. And my hope is that we're going to see that same kind of almost disconnect between the politics and the on-the-ground activity around questions of adaptation. And so you see, right, the Republican governor of Florida, who has been a stalwart resistor of climate policy action, nonetheless investing in wetlands, nonetheless investing in clean water, because he recognizes the important impacts for protecting populations in Florida from storms, from flooding.
Thank you.
Before I go to the next speaker, and I'm going to hold some of the questions in the chat for after, but Megan, do you think people understand this? Like, leaders like DeSantis are talking from both sides of their mouths on this?
I think climate change has become this sort of looming behemoth, right? That clouds people's judgments about the specific activities we could do, the specific changes we could make that would make a difference. And so it's become part of the rhetoric of division. It's become part of a shorthand we use to hold our political opponents on the other side. It's when there's a possibility of talking about things that are smaller and more local and not sort of immediately connected to that big behemoth out there, then action becomes more possible. And so I'm not talking about like, oh, we just do climate adaptation without the language of climate. I'm really talking about bringing it down to specific issues, right? About, the construction of a wind, wind turbines in Texas, right? Which is delivering immediate local economic benefits in a community. And the community is just focused on that. They're not focused on the connection between these wind turbines and that big behemoth of a problem that divides us.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Megan. I'm going to move on to Anais Reyes, Senior Exhibitions Associate of the Climate Museum. And we wanted to invite someone from the Climate Museum because I think they're doing very important work in the narrative around climate change. So Anais, can you share with us what the Climate Museum is doing?
Hi there. Yes, definitely. Let me share my screen. All right. Oops. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Anais Reyes. I'm the Senior Exhibitions Associate at the Climate Museum. Miranda sends her apologies that she couldn't be here today, but I'm so excited to speak to you all. So thank you very much for having me. So the Climate Museum is based in New York City. We're the first museum focused on climate change and climate action in the US. And our mission is to inspire action on the climate crisis through exhibitions and cultural programs that deepen understanding, build connections, and advance just solutions. And so we don't just talk about climate science. We focus on the arts and the humanities and the social impacts in a way that brings more people into this crucial conversation. We've done public programs since about 2017, but I will talk about our last pop-up exhibition to kind of share our philosophy of change. This exhibition ran from October 2022 to April 2023 in Manhattan, and it was an exhibition in 3 parts. So the first part was this artwork by David Opdyke. It's what he called a postcard mural entitled "Someday All This." So this artist combined vintage postcards that he painted on top of into a landscape scene that as a whole tells a fictional story about climate change in the future, but individually each postcard becomes its own snapshot of the story. And as you can see here, it really drew people in. It allowed people to find different pieces of the artwork or individual postcards that they resonated with. And so at the Climate Museum, we use the arts as a way to build these connections between climate change and personal experiences, understandings, emotions, in order to get people more actively engaged on the issue. And so one statistic that's crucial to how we relate to our visitors is that 66% of Americans are worried about climate change, but only 5% talk about it. This is from Yale and George Mason universities. So most people in the US are worried about climate change, but because no one is talking about it, no one really knows what to do about it. It creates what researchers call a spiral of silence. And it creates this feedback loop that breeds inaction. And we use art as an entry point to connect people to action as a tool to help people turn away from the hopelessness and towards motivation and towards agency. And so this artist, David Opdyke, was very happy that his artwork could be exhibited at the Climate Museum, specifically to inspire people to act, which I'll talk about more in the following parts. And so the second part of the show offered some mind-blowing insights on how the public understands and misunderstands climate change. And I think it's very interesting to go after Megan Mullin, and hopefully this doesn't come off as oppositional in any way, but we found research that there is actually a very large bipartisan supermajority in support of climate policy, research from Yale and George Mason University again, and that there's this myth that there is not enough support for policy. And because of that spiral, people don't know that there's this overwhelming support. We found that 72% of New Yorkers are concerned about climate change, but we believe that it's much less, only 44%. And that same pattern, believing that there is not support when there is majority support, is also in conservative states. So for example, Mississippi, 61% of people are concerned, but they actually think when polled that only 33% of people are concerned. And this study also found that two-thirds of Americans support the Green New Deal, but we kind of believe that it's the opposite. And so this research found that people's understanding of climate change is so off that they termed it a false social reality. That that term carries so much weight behind it, we had to include it in this show. And that false social reality holds us back from doing something about it, from implementing climate policy, from talking to other people, from pushing the solutions that we need at every scale. And so one thing that we talk about doing is busting that myth. We have to bust that myth that people don't care, that there's not support, that like I said, there is a bipartisan supermajority in support of climate justice. And by talking about it, by sharing that information, by coming together with others, we can bust that myth, which is what we do at the museum. And so this goes into the third part, committing to take action. Talking to people to bust the myth was one of the actions in this show. And it's one that we've continued to go back to just because we found it so surprising, and people always respond to it, with the same surprise that we had, and then it inspires them to act more. So we had this interactive sticker wall. We had about 12 different stickers, each labeled with a different action a person could take. So it had things like, I'm going to vote climate, I'm going to call or write my representatives, I'm going to talk to 3 people to bust the myth. And people picked ones, again, that resonated with them the most and then stuck them up on the wall. And they often left notes with personalized writing, with signatures, with dates. And so all of our actions focus on collective and civic, they're focused on the collective and civic perspective, finding a way to kind of have a multiplicative impact over just an individual one, because we do need systemic change and cultural change to address the issue at scale. And so the sticker wall, it was not only just a fun activity for people of all ages, all backgrounds. We had a lot of tours come into the space, high schoolers, elementary schoolers, college, corporate groups. And so it was a really fun way to get everyone involved. But more importantly, it was a way for people to see everyone else's care and concern and commitment to doing something about the issue and to breaking the climate silence. And so by the end of the exhibition, we had thousands of stickers on this wall, even overflowing into corners that we didn't expect. But we loved seeing people's enthusiasm and excitement about wanting to be a part of this. And so as part of the pop-up, we also hold events that dive into a wide range of topics, from climate arts, climate justice, youth activism, how to have climate conversations, and even how to get involved with local organizations on local, as Megan Mullin said, on more local aspects of climate change. And so we want this space to be for people to convene and to learn about these ideas from experts, to join a community of like-minded people who are also inspired to act. Fundamentally, the work of the Climate Museum focuses on meeting people where they are at and inviting them to start where they are, wherever they're coming from. And we ask our audience to view themselves within the landscape of climate solutions and to realize that there is empowerment in working together. And so we had this guest book that people left comments throughout the show. And one that struck me most was someone wrote that they felt surprised, but at home, like this was something that I didn't know I needed. And so we hope that through the arts, by sharing these perspectives with a wider audience, we can bring all those who are wondering what they can do about climate change into the conversation. And we're about to open up our second pop-up this fall in Manhattan about the intersections of climate change and social inequality, and how, again, we can come together to act. And we hope to share more with everyone soon and invite you all to join us there. And we're hoping to scale up to a year-round space in hopefully the near future to welcome even more people. Thank you.
Thank you, Anais. how will the Climate Museum make this information or make this inspiration available outside New York, outside the people that walk, people that walk into a space like that? I'm guessing, and maybe it's just prejudice, but I'm guessing a climate denial Republican is not going to walk inside the Climate Museum, or are they?
Yeah, no, they're not. But one way that we think about, well, let me answer your question in two parts. So first, we do have a lot of online resources and online events where people from all over the world have joined us. We've had high school interns, especially during COVID, our programming on this, it was a double-edged sword, but the silver lining was we got to welcome people from India, people from South America, people, who would wake up at 2 a.m. just to join us to learn more about climate change. And it was such a powerful and humbling experience. And at the same time, we know that a conservative Republican isn't going to come to the museum and listen to what we have to say. But the point is that there are so many people who are concerned and worried and are on the verge of wanting to do something, who are on the verge of the question that everyone asks when they come to us is, what can I do? And so we have to provide, our audience is those people who come to us asking, begging us, what can I do? I'm so worried. And that is so many people, that's such a high percentage of the population that we don't really have to pay attention to the people who are denying us. That's not our audience, because we're focused on the people who want to get involved and who want to do something.
Gotcha, touche. I think that's a good answer. And I think it goes a little bit to what Sunita asked in the chat. And I really want to have that conversation. Now, Sunita, you want to ask your question out loud, and we're in the last few minutes, but I think it's worth.
Yeah. So my question was, what about the developing world, which is impacted so much more immediately with climate change? What can we expect, for example, at the next COP? I know you've answered some of my comments in the chat, Megan, but I'm wondering what all of you all might think of that. And I wanted to tie it to what's happening now in Morocco, in Libya. Are these climate change issues, and how can leaders around the world, when we see these tangible impacts of climate change, how are leaders around the world responding?
So I guess, I can.
For anyone who wants to answer, and after Anais.
So thank you. Actually, our next exhibition, like I said, is on climate change and inequality in both a local and a global sense, because we do also have to talk about this and the injustices, that the fundamental injustice that climate change is to people who did not cause climate change. And so I think, in terms of we'll see how the audience responds to our next show, but we understand that that's a crucial conversation to be had, and that's exactly why it's our next show. So we hope to introduce it to people, so we can use that information, tie it to arts, and motivate them to act.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in. John, Megan, we're talking in the chat. Hannah, on the same question.
Yeah, on the topic for the next Conference of the Parties, as we're seeing more of these impacts really come into fruition, I expect there'll be even louder calls from the countries that are feeling most of those impacts, similar to what was just mentioned for in the technical terminology of the COP, this loss and damage discussion. So how should the countries that have historically polluted the most be compensating the places that are feeling the most damage, which are often not the countries that are most responsible for the problem? I think that'll be continue to be a big part of the discussion as it has been recently.
Anyone else? That, or maybe your last thoughts of, stories that we should be covering around this.
Well, I think I would say I look forward to seeing the stories that you cover, because I think it's really in recognizing that these issues are as much cultural as they are environmental, as much as they are about science and politics and economics. And you all really have, such an important role to play in that I'm very, very interested and eager to see where this reporting, for your communities takes you, so that we can learn from that.
And Megan, I think what you just wrote is very important, is that this partisan divide is smaller among younger generations.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
there's hope there.
The literacy of young people on climate change is leaps and bounds beyond what, the literacy of older generations. And that translates into smaller divides, right? Even among young Republicans, right? We're seeing more recognition of this problem and more recognition, right, of that linkage between these local manifestations and the bigger global phenomenon. And so it's stories like those that you all can produce in your communities that help people understand those linkages, not just to tackle the immediate problem of heat or flooding or drought, right? Whatever the immediate manifestation is, but also to help us translate that into action that will slow this broader set of changes.
There's a few ideas for stories in what you just said. Thank you. I don't know, Hannah, any suggestions? Well, your tool seems like a very good place to start.
I like the tone of optimism that is here about sort of youth being less divided on this topic, and I'm happy to hear that from that is supported in Megan's expertise on the public polling research. Thank you for sharing that and giving us some optimism.
Yes, absolutely. Anais, any suggestions other than write about the Climate Museum?
I mean, I guess I would just say that there's a lot of weight behind people power. So writing stories that can motivate people to act, and motivation can come from positive and negative. It can come from inspiration. It can come from anger. So I think mobilizing the people feels most important to me.
Awesome. Well, we've come to the end of this briefing. It just went too fast for me, but thank you everyone for your very insightful and very different way of looking at this. It's really thought-provoking. And thank you for the media that joined us. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good weekend.